Hey guys, Sly here, and welcome back to another episode of the Caspian Game Awards. So tonight, we are going to be covering, honestly, if I'm going to be honest, one of the best years in gaming history for sure. The legendary year that is 2001. So, obviously, before we get into this, I just want to apologize to everyone about the fact that, yes, we did try doing this before a month ago, but because of some technical difficulties, literally halfway through, it kind of ultimately resulted us having to do this tonight. Which I'm fine with, don't get it twisted, but it is unfortunate that we basically had to delay an entire month just dedicated to this. But I ended up actually kind of changing a few things since the initial recording. And so, basically see this as like the true, list that we'll be doing, which I'm pretty excited about. So, but yeah, like, God, it's going to be so exciting for me to talk about 2001, because if I'm going to be honest, this was a pretty good year. Do I think it's, like, the best year in gaming history? You can make a good case, but for me personally, it's definitely easily top 5, for sure. And I'm definitely excited to go over the games, which, of course, for those who are new to the series, this is basically me doing the Game Awards, either redoing them, which I did for most of the episodes that we've done, or in the case of 2002, 2001, and some of the other years we'll be covering, we basically make up our own Game Awards, so we can actually, give proper respect to what could have been nominated back in the day, if the Game Awards actually existed. So I'm pretty excited about talking about what we got here. But of course, before we actually get into the thing proper, let's sort of go over the rules, which, generally speaking, it's going to be pretty much the same that we've done before. So, as far as like the actual nominees that we're going to have, which I'll show the categories later for those who are new to this series. I'll go over the categories, coming up real soon. But as far as the nominees, what qualifies for it to be a nomination is, number one, it must have released between January 6th and December 31st of that year, because we are not the Grammys.
Don't yell at me, yell at the Grammys.
We do not like it whenever there's like weird cutoff dates. It has to be fully from within that year. So, none of that stuff. Also, as far as the nominees per category, there can only be between 4 to 6 nominees, because we don't want it to be too bloated, and we don't want it to be too small. So, that's of course what we'll be doing here. And then, as far as the initial release, we are counting the official release of the game, not just the North American releases, because even though there are some games that most people think released in 2001, or in some of the previous years we talked about, they released in Japan a year or potentially 2 years prior. And so we're only counting the years that they officially came out, even if it wasn't a North American release. So we'll get to that when we get to it. But also, this was more of a subtle rule, but I think it should be pretty obvious by this point. Only one game per franchise per nomination, which I don't know why I misspelled that. Let me make sure to change it a bit. There we go. So yeah, only one game per franchise per nomination, per like category. So if a game had 2 games within the franchise come out the same day, they can only qualify for like one category at a time. So those are the general sort of like things there. Main rule number 2, involving Game of the Year, it basically just needs to be a generally liked game for it to be accepted if it's going to be a Game of the Year award. However, if it's in a particularly bad year, if I have to, I will nominate games. I will just only nominate the games that I personally liked. So that's only if I have to do it if it's only absolutely necessary. I know I had to do that with a few of the years we've talked about in the past, but I'm pretty sure with 2001 it's it was pretty easy. So, and well, it has to be a completely new game. So remakes and remasters do not count. Not that there were too many of those by this point, so that's fine. And well, truth be told, we can only really have games that I'm personally interested in, because this is a biased show and I don't care because it's my show. So, because things that I like, most people may not like in particular. So, or vice versa. That being said though, 2001 was a really damn good year. So I don't think I think no matter what I choose, people are going to agree. Because, goddamn, like, it was, just like with like some of the previous years we talked about, it was kind of hard choosing what I ultimately wanted to do for the categories, because there was just so much stuff. But there is unfortunately one caveat to this, and it's the unfortunate truth that the only category that we will not have is the best expansion category, mainly just because, if I'm going to be honest, I just couldn't find like enough from 2001 to really justify getting that, which is a bit upsetting. But at the end of the day, like, we have every other category that I'm going to have here. That being said though, it is also unfortunate to say, but this year will most likely be the last year that we'll be talking about, where we will be giving out a best narrative and best multiplayer nomination. Like, I know that's very upsetting, because, you know, I do find those categories to be very important, but let's be real here. Once we start getting further and further away from the modern era, it starts getting harder to, it basically just gets harder to like figure out what games to like qualify for those categories, especially the best multiplayer category, as multiplayer games were still kind of like new at the time, or at least multiplayer in the way which we know it now. But in any event, I'm pretty excited. I don't think there's really anything else I've got to say, so I think we're gonna jump right into it. So yeah, let's begin. And of course, lest we forget, I've got the envelope. I actually found my other envelope, so I actually have two of these now, but I'll just only use the one that, like, just the... Yeah, we'll use this one. We'll use this one for Game of the Year, but of course we'll get to that later. But let's go over Best Game by New Studio, which at first I thought there actually weren't going to be enough games for this category, but, well, I think I found just enough games to really have this at least sticking around for a while, which, fair enough. We want to make sure that we can honor newer, upcoming game devs, and I think this is definitely the best, place to do so. So what did I end up choosing? Well, we've got ourselves some pretty interesting nominees as far as this category. And keep in mind that this category is for not necessarily your first game, it's the first game that got you attention. And let's just say that 2001 gave a lot of attention to the original classic version of RuneScape. This game pretty much took the world by storm years before World of Warcraft came out, which is insane, especially since this was a small up-and-coming indie MMO made in some guy's basement. Like, the fact that this game has not only has it, like, it was such a big deal back in the early to mid 2000s, but also is still respected to this day, is a huge testament. And so I feel like it makes a ton of sense to put the RuneScape on here. Like, I will admit, it's not entirely my jam, especially since a lot of the game can be kind of clunky at points, but it is still a game that needs to at least be, like, respected. So, I feel like I had to. But as far as other games by up and coming studio, by the way, I think they're called Jagex Entertainment, I think is who originally made RuneScape Classic. Let me double check. Yeah, Jagex. So, of course, they would eventually, work on the newer RuneScape and a few other projects. So, it makes sense. Which, speaking of things that make sense, let's do the opposite of that. We got Black and White. So I will admit I was hesitant on actually putting this here because this was made by Lionhead Studios, which, if that name sounds familiar, well, that is because they would eventually make the Fable games, which you guys know I'm not the biggest fan of, but I will say I at least respect this game. Because this is a sort of simulation strategy hybrid game where you basically you basically take the form of God and gather a bunch of people to worship you and pretty much conquer the entire continents that you're on. It's a lot. I know that sounds complicated, but it's actually easier once you actually see the game. I will admit, it is a very flawed game. It has a lot of faults, but it was pretty interesting for the time, and in some ways innovated a lot on the simulation genre. Especially since there weren't really a lot of sandboxy sort of games like it at the time. So even though this isn't a game that I would say I would recommend for modern audiences, if you want to get to know the history of sandboxy strategy games, go check out Black and White. Even though the art direction is kind of iffy, at the end of the day, it's a very important game. Which, speaking of important games, we got Operation Flashpoint, Cold War Crisis, made by Bohemia Entertainment. Or Bohemia Interactive, excuse me. And, published by Codemasters. Which, this is a big deal, because this was a tactical shooter, for those who don't know. This was a tactical shooter, so, it's very much more in line with, military simulation stuff. And what made this stand out is this was one of the earliest games to have vehicular combat, and one of the earliest games to be an open world shooter game. It wasn't necessarily the first game to do it, but it was definitely the first game that got people's attention. And Bohemia Interactive, of course, would make Arma, and Codemasters would eventually make the sequels to this game. But you get the point. This game helped sort of define tactical shooters like Arma, like Squad, like Hell Let Loose. All of the big names in that scene, they have to directly thank this game for that. And I feel like that's more than enough to warrant a nod here. And then we got Gothic, which I will admit, this one I'm also kind of iffy about because, the developers didn't necessarily, have the best track record after this. But Gothic was, again, a pretty, decent game when it came out. Very big in the RPG category, similar to RuneScape, but more single-player focused. And I don't know, it's kind of funny because this honestly feels more like a Bethesda game at points. It just kind of feels like it has... I don't know, it honestly kind of feels very similar to an Elder Scrolls game, but exclusively in third person. Which I guess you can kind of, you could make a good case that a lot of the systems in more recent, open world RPGs took a lot of inspiration from this game. And so, because of the legacy that this game has, as well as its sequel, and the fact that this game's actually getting a full-on remake, I think it makes sense to at least give it, like, due diligence. So, and then last but not least, we've got ourselves the original Burnout from, 2001. Of course, every game's from 2001. We got Burnout, which, keep in mind, though, Criterion, this wasn't their first game. Like, they've been around since, like, the late 90s, but they didn't really have, like, a big name title until this game came out. Like, this, along with another game, which we'll get into later, that they released in 2001, those were the games that really did put them on the map. And, well, I mean, Criterion would eventually make the sequels, and they would eventually help with some of the Need for Speed games, even making a few other games we talked about in some of our other episodes. And so I think, even though, like, this may not be the best game in the series, excuse me, it's definitely a very important game as far as racing games are concerned. So, but yeah, like, as far as, like, games, you can tell that, like, 2001, like, there was a lot of stuff that was working and for, like, the groundworks for a lot of the systems that we know now. So ultimately, these may not be, like, household names nowadays. Back in the day, they certainly were. But, of course, we can only really choose one for the winner, so let's go over that. So, here we go. So, the award for the best game by a new studio of 2001 goes to Burnout. Again, this might be an iffy choice for some people because this is not the best game in the series, but I ultimately think that this is, like, surprisingly, the one that makes the most sense because of the legacy that Criterion would eventually have with the Burnout name. And even just putting that aside, this game, when you look at it at first, like, it's a pretty decent sort of racing experience, more on the arcadey side, definitely more in line with, like, Need for Speed than something that's like a Gran Turismo. But what really made this game stand out compared to the competition was the fact that this game had the dynamic car crashes that became infamous with the rest of the series. Like, this game pretty much, like, took the idea of using the in-game, like, car physics to its advantage. And this makes it one of the earliest games that really started to dive into the idea of physics in video games. Because before then, and even during the early 2000s, a lot of games just were pretty stagnant as far as, like, interactability with a lot of the environment. But this game just basically was like, fuck it, let's just give them the ability to just, ram into each other. So, and that's pretty cool. And yes, Gran Turismo was, successful, like, in places. Burnout was definitely a good indicator that, like, maybe racing games on console are actually pretty much viable. Outside of Gran Turismo. So ultimately, I do think that, like, Burnout, even though, like, it's probably the best choice if we're just kind of looking at it in the long term, like, grand scheme of things. So that's my pick. But let's move away from the new kids on the block and let's go into the action adventure category, which I would say this was a really, really, really big year for the action adventure genre. Because, wow, the games that released this year were, let's just say they changed the way in which, like, they changed the game a lot. Like, we just hit the appetizers. Let's get into the main course. Oh, shoot, I don't have water. God damn it. Whatever. I'll get water after this section, so I hope you guys don't mind. But action adventure, which of course this category encompasses just everything under that belt, plus horror games. And keep in mind with the horror game part. But look at this. Yeah. You're seeing your screen correctly. Several of the most iconic games of all time, spawned from this year. But let's not focus on those yet. Let's start with like some of the lesser known games first that I'm going to be nominating for this. Let's start off with Onimusha Warlords. So this was sort of an experimental game that Capcom was doing at the time. Basically taking like the Resident Evil engine that they were working on at the time, but applying it to more of a, or at least like the camera system, and applying it more to a hack and slash. And as far as like basically just doing like a fixed camera positioned like hack and slash, like usually I'm not the type of person who likes fixed cameras. It's just nothing that I really liked at all. But like I feel like this surprisingly was one of the exceptions that I could say ended up working, especially within that transition from the 5th gen to the 6th gen of consoles. And I mean, you know, people kind of forget, but like the early 2000s, there were a lot of like games based off of like ancient China and feudal Japan in this game's case. And this one was able to stand out, I feel like, because of just its more, you know, inspired but like unique approach as far as like, you know, the setting and just sort of its general gameplay. So I recommend you guys check it out for yourselves. Like, it may not be everyone's cup of tea, but like if you like that sort of system, you may like Onimusha. And well, I finally have an excuse to actually talk about Dynasty Warriors after a long time. Dynasty Warriors 3. So this game obviously continued the approach that Dynasty Warriors 2 did, where it went from being a fighting game series to just straight up a general hack and slash sort of massive battle system. And yeah, no, I would definitely say that this game was a lot of fun. Like, it improved a lot of like the weird quirks that were in Dynasty Warriors 2, smoothed it all out, and just delivered on, like, it basically just kind of delivered on a lot of what people may have saw as technical limitations with the launch title of Dynasty Warriors 2. Like, it's basically just Dynasty Warriors 2, but more polished. And I think that's all you really need to do. You don't need to really reinvent the wheel, especially since, you know, this game came out less than a year after the previous game. But it's still, like, you know, fun regardless. And pretty much solidified this, like, basically solidified the path that the franchise would go from that point onwards. So I wanted to at least give it a nod. But let's be real here. Those aren't like what a lot of people would think of as far as best action adventure. You guys know, like, one of the biggest games that came out of that year was, of course, the original Devil May Cry. This game pretty much defined hack and slash games for the entirety of the 2000s. Like, and it's really funny because this was originally going to be Resident Evil 4. but they eventually changed it into its own thing. And yeah, no, I think it worked wonders. Like, fluid combat, a pretty badass lead role, some a very memorable and iconic sort of locale that, people still remember to this day. And well, yes, this game also kind of had a bit of a fixed camera thing going on. Again, similar to Onimusha, I think that it works in the context of this game. And I don't know, it's just a game that's pretty badass, with a badass soundtrack too. So yeah, Devil May Cry easily deserves a nod. And then we got Silent Hill 2, another game that took the world by storm in 2001. A game that we streamed that, that has held up to even to this day. Like, and yes, even though this game's getting a remake, I think it's actually releasing next month, which is insane. Like Silent Hill 2, the original version, is really like a huge testament as far. Oh my! Holy shit! It's actually coming out next week. Huh. Okay, it's coming out next week. Okay, that's I didn't actually realize that. Wow. Dang. Okay, but whatever. Silent Hill 2, very, very big as far as narrative-based experiences. That's for sure. And pretty big as far as survival horror games are concerned. So go check it out if you guys haven't. And well, literally within a few months period, within a month period after Silent Hill 2's release, we would also get another impactful game. 3 in a row, baby. Grand Theft Auto 3. Which, yes, wasn't the first game in the GTA franchise. It was the first game to go fully 3D and really take advantage of being an open world. Granted, it is still pretty limited as far as side activities compared to the later games in the franchise. This game is still highly regarded as being one of the most important games in open world, games as a whole. As far as their general structure, the idea of using the locales to your advantage, or let me rephrase that, basically using the environment for, using the environment to be a bit more immersive. That's what I meant to say. And just the, basically just kind of being the progenitor for a lot of, other, open world crime games. So it makes sense as to why, GTA 3 is on here. And then last but not least, we've got ourselves Metal Gear Solid 2, which, I mean, it's obviously continues off of the events that were set up in the original Metal Gear, in the first Metal Gear Solid, continuing a lot of the, themes about espionage and conspiracies and government control, and fine-tuning the stealth to being a bit more manageable, even adding in the first-person perspective for whenever you're trying to take down enemies. It's definitely a game that I think people, I feel like people over the years have just been kind of about it in comparison to Metal Gear Solid 1 and 3, but I still think that 2 deserves a lot of respect, and we're gonna give it here. So, but yeah, you can see this year was, you're starting to see how much this year is gonna ramp up as far as the different games that we're talking about. Again, it should not be understated just how big 2001 was for just general action adventure games. Like, it's actually insane that all of these came out the same year. But alas, as much as it pains me to say, there can only be one winner. So let's get into that. So the award for the best action adventure game of 2001 goes to Devil May Cry. Yeah, it was tough, but I ultimately chose the original Devil May Cry because, I mean, this game pretty much had, the foundations for how we see hack and slash games, at least at that time. It had pretty intense and fun combat with the, different combos that you can do. Granted, they were kind of hard to, really do in this game, it seemed. Especially earlier on. But once you start, getting a lot of the stuff, some of the more unlockable stuff, it starts getting a bit better. But even though that might be a bit of an issue, what isn't an issue is the characters. I mean, Dante, and we talked about him in literally yesterday's stream. Dante is a badass. He really does personify just how you make basically kind of an edgelord character archetype into one that is pretty likable at the end of the day. And I mean, it's also complemented by a lot of the other side characters that are around, including the bosses. So, there's some pretty iconic, bosses that we have here, which is obviously also complemented by just the beautiful looking architecture that you're surrounded by. Which, again, this was supposed to be Resident Evil 4, so it makes sense as to why they have a bit of a dark fantasy, horror look to the whole thing. But it really does try to make it its own, which is something that I think is pretty cool. And, well, this game did popularize hack and slash games for a time. For better or for worse, you can pretty much argue. But, I mean, Devil May Cry really did walk so that other franchises like God of War and Bayonetta could run. So, ultimately, I think that this deserves the win for this category in particular. So, but yeah, before we get into the next category, I'll be right back. I'm just gonna fill up my water bottle. So I'll be right back. Alright, there we go, I'm back. Yeah, sorry, I grabbed this because, like, unfortunately this stupid thing broke, so I need to get it. I need to order that. I need to order a new one. But anyways, so oh yeah. But yeah, next category. Best platform game. So I'm not gonna lie, this was probably the toughest like one for me to try to choose. Cause like I don't know, like I mean I think I've mentioned this plenty of times before, but like platformers were definitely starting to wane in the early 2000s. Like that was just unfortunately kind of the beginning of the end of that genre. And it was pretty reflective of this year. Like if I'm going to be honest, this is probably the weakest category for this sort of thing. Sorry, I'm trying to like remember some names. Sorry, I'm bad at multitasking. But anyways, like, and I will admit, the choices that I do have on here, I will admit, they may not be the greatest, but like I do feel like that it's probably for the best for me to at least acknowledge. Excuse me, like acknowledge, you know, how, you know, decent of an impact some of these games had. And so I ended up choosing these games. But let's get the obvious out of the way. Do I think Spyro Citizen of Ice is like a great game? No. It's a deeply flawed Game Boy Color game, or not Game Boy Color, Game Boy Advance game that, you know, its sequel would basically improve upon. But it did get decent amount of like, you know, positive press. So like not only does it kind of, you know, qualify here, but also I mean, I like Spyro. It's a series that like I really do like. And as far as transitioning like into a Game Boy Advance, it's fine. Like I'm not gonna like pretend that it was amazing, but like it was okay as far as like you know, that sort of like, you know, style. Granted, it's kind of weird thinking about it being granted, yeah, it's kind of weird to like think of like Spyro basically going from like 3D to 2D, because like let's be real, like Game Boy Advance is basically just the same thing as a Super Nintendo. But it was a decent, like it was at least a decent sort of, you know, port, like sort of like transition. But as far as the other games, I think they make a late. I definitely do think that a lot of people think that they make way more sense. Klonoa 2, Lunacy's Veil, or Lunatia. I don't know how to pronounce that. I'm sorry. Klonoa 2, obviously the sequel to 1997's Klonoa. Like sort of continuing on the sort of, you know, kind of cutesy looking thing that they were going on there. And transitioning it into more of a proper 3D game as opposed to the 2.5D that the original was known for. Like, it was definitely a decent sort of, you know, experience that if you guys like that sort of aesthetic, try to seek it out if that, you know, piques your interest. So, and then we got Oddworld Munch's Odyssey, which was actually an Xbox launch title, which I actually didn't realize until like years after I heard about this game. And obviously this is the sequel, or at least the loose sequel to Abe's Odyssey and Abe's Exodus. And so this was definitely more, like I said, a continuation of like that storyline within the Oddworld series. And again, it also was a game that transitioned from 2D to like 2.5D to 3D. And so it definitely took advantage of the change of environment. And yeah, like it's just kind of more like I said, just kind of a decent, like, sort of like experience that, you know, continues off a lot of the themes about capitalism and just kind of the dangers of, you know, that sort of, like, you know, like basically like corporatizing everything. I mean, hell, you see the cover of the game right there. It's literally like written as if it was like an advertisement on a can, like a soda can. So yeah, like even on the cover, it just, you know, screams that sort of style. So if that interests you, there you go. And then last but not least, we got ourselves Jak and Daxter, the Precursor Legacy, which I've mentioned this before. Like, I didn't grow up with Jak and Daxter as much as I did Ratchet and Clank or Sly Cooper or some of the other big, like, games that were on the PlayStation 2. But, like, I still at least do respect, you know, the games. Which is kind of weird, especially since, like, this first game was definitely a lot more lighthearted compared to the sequels. Like, this was still kind of in that era in which Naughty Dog were not necessarily doing narrative-driven stuff, and you were just kind of doing the, you know, platformer thing. I mean, this obviously was the follow-up to what Naughty Dog were doing with, you know, the Crash Bandicoot games. And so they basically just kind of expanded it into more, like, you know, open-ended level design. So, yeah, I'd say Jak and Daxter, it makes sense as to why, like, it's here. But, I don't know. If I'm going to be honest, I don't really have much to say about these games. Because, again, this is admittedly the weakest category. But, like, they're all still decent experiences. I'm not saying these games are bad by any stretch of the imagination. Like, probably the weakest one on here is Spyro Seasons of Ice. But, like, I guess it just really does go to show that, like, yeah, platformers were starting to, like, wane a little bit. Which I know I've been saying that a lot, but I'm just trying to emphasize that, you know, there's a reason as to why there's not really platformers anymore. It's because over time they just kind of fell out of favor. So, which, I mean, to be fair, 2002 was a pretty strong year for platformers, but I guess it's just kind of, I'm just kind of being realistic about it. So, but anyways, let's go over the winner. So here we go. So, the award for the best platformer game of 2001 goes to Jak and Daxter. If I ultimately had to choose a game with this category, it'd be this one. Even though I didn't grow with this game as much, I still do respect it. Like, what I really do find pretty cool about this game is, well, not only that it was a bit more open compared to Naughty Dog's previous games with the Crash Bandicoot series, but it was also a seamless world design. Like, it wasn't technically open world because it was still very linear, but it was like, there were little to no loading screens at all. Like, not even hidden ones. Like, maybe in the cutscenes, but, like, if you go into the game, you're in the game. Like, there's no there's no area in which you're pretty much, like, you know, out of the experience, which I have to admit was a pretty cool thing at the time that, well, a lot of people definitely wish was a lot more common nowadays. But, like, it really does prove that, yeah, no, gaming was innovating in the 6th generation. And, well, it's helped by the fact that this game is driven with a lot of character and personality. Of course, Daxter steals the show, being just sort of like the more, you know, comedic sidekick character, in which, of course, you have to save him from, or not save him, but kind of see if you can change it back. And it's also complemented by just the, you know, aesthetics of the game. It has a really cool, like, fantasy, steampunk-ish sort of hybrid look that I think really does work in its favor. And I will admit the one big issue with the game is that it is a bit too short, but even besides that, it's still a pretty decent experience throughout. And so overall, I'd recommend you guys check out Jak and Daxter if you guys haven't already. So yeah. All right. Role-playing games. So this was a massive year for RPGs. Way bigger than I thought it was going to be. Like, goddamn, was this year insane for this category. So, like, I had to unfortunately snub, like, maybe one or two. But what did I choose in general? Well, obviously, I chose RuneScape and Gothic to represent the list, which, I mean, makes sense. So, but I also decided that I'm actually going to choose some more Game Boy Advance games, which, I mean, Game Boy Advance was still new, so, of course. Well, it came out that year, of course, because this was the year that the Xbox, GameCube, and Game Boy Advance came out, so, yeah. But as far as, like, other, like, RPGs, I want to give a shout out to Castlevania Circle of the Moon, which I've praised the other Game Boy Advance Castlevania games so far, and well, this game is no exception. Like, of course, this was the first game to kind of, you know, follow up on the truly follow up on the footsteps that Symphony of the Night set up, and you know, you can definitely argue if it's better or not, but the fact that, like, it at least tried to, you know, follow that up is something that I can appreciate, especially since that's my personal favorite style of Castlevania in general, is the more Metroidvania style. And, well, of course I'm going to like this game because of it, so it makes sense to have it here. What also makes sense to have on here is the original the Final Fantasy X, excuse me. Which, I will admit, this isn't one of my favorite Final Fantasy games, at least, like, aesthetically, but what this game pretty much did, I think, overall, was a net positive for the franchise as a whole. I mean, this was the first, like, you know, more open, like, no, what was it? It was definitely the first game that was fully 3D. It was, like, it wasn't fully, like, open world, but it was definitely, like, the first 3D game fully, because Final Fantasy beforehand, in the 5th generation with the PlayStation 1, they were all just, you stilled backgrounds. This was the first game to really be fully in 3D, and was a bit more on the contemporary side, and so I think that that's something that, again, is a change of pace that, like, I can definitely see why a lot of people like. So, and then we've got ourselves a game that, like, was also a pretty decently, like, popular MMO, but it was a bit more, like, inspired by, like, medieval folklore, and I wanted to give a shout out to it. Dark Age of Camelot. So, maybe not the most recognizable name in, you know, the RPG sphere, but it's a setting that, like, I think is pretty cool. Again, doing, like, a bit of a historical fantasy thing going on, and being, like, one of the, like, another early example of, like, an MMO that really was ahead of the curve. So, I wanted to give it a shout out. And last but not least, I'm also going to give it a shout out to Golden Sun, also for the Game Boy Advance. So, again, this is probably the game that, like, this game didn't really reinvent the wheel as much, but it's just a solid overall experience. for the Game Boy Advance that was more of a traditional like RPG as opposed to what Castlevania here was doing. It was a bit more in the lines of like the Mana or the older Final Fantasy games. And so I wanted to at least give it a shout out. So, but yeah, let's go over the winner. So, the award for the best game for the first excuse me. So, the award for the best role-playing game of 2001 goes to Final Fantasy X. Yeah, I know, it's like a very cliche answer, especially since this is a lot of people's favorite. But like, overall, I do think this game being a net positive, leap for the franchise, I think it ultimately makes sense to have this be the winner. I mean, first of all, this was the first fully 3D game in the series, like I mentioned before. It may not have been the open world quite yet, but at least kind of walked for that eventual change. And that's something that I think deserves a lot of credit here. Also, this was also the first fully voice-acted game in the series, which I will admit that does lead to some weird dialogue at points. If you guys know, you know, but this at least represented like a shift towards having more voice acting in role-playing games, which obviously takes a lot of effort, especially since RPGs, most of them are pretty much open world now. If not, they're still just very huge games as a whole. And so that might be that was seen as a daunting task at the time. But this game was like, you know what? We're going to do it. And they did it, and it succeeded. So, also, this game has a very unique progression system that isn't really covered a lot in, videos that I've seen people talk about this game. Like, it basically has a progression system that was sort of the progenitor for how we see progression systems in games now, where it's a bit more grid-based as opposed to, the general free-flowy gameplay-based progression that we see in that we saw in a lot of, pre-2000s RPGs. So this game was definitely a trendsetter in that regard. And whether you like the old system or the new or more modern systems, this was definitely the game that set that up. Whether you prefer the this or the older version, that's ultimately up to you. But for me personally, I like the fact that they at least did something like that. And well, of course, being on the 6th generation as opposed to the 5th generation, a lot of the weird quirks that having a 2D Final Fantasy game were pretty much polished up. And also the fact that this game was more on the casual side, as I mean casual, I mean more contemporary feeling. It was still kind of a sci-fi Final Fantasy game, but it was a bit more just relaxed. Was definitely a change of pace. So I gotta give props to this game. And well, I think it definitely deserves the win. Alright. Shooter games. This was another pretty big year. This was another category that was pretty big for 2001. It should not be understated just how big of a year it was for the shooter category as well. Granted, there's going to be some names that may not be familiar now, but back in the day were a big deal and even helped push for a lot of other innovations that we would see. So let's of course go over what we have here. So, and keep in mind, most of this is single player based. So do keep that in mind. But let's begin with Serious Sam, the First Encounter. So this game, of course, was kind of one of the last of the original wave of retro shooters or like Quake/Doom clones. Like it was kind of like the last of that like original wave. But this game stood out compared to the rest of its competition because of the open levels that this game had, where you just fight massive waves of enemies at once. It was pretty fun. And well, yeah, Sam Stone, you can definitely say, is basically just a discount Duke Nukem. He still has like some occasionally pretty funny lines himself that, like, you know, at least make him seem a bit more, you know, unique in some ways. So, granted, I will say this game is weird, like very weird, especially with its enemies. But I kind of see it in a similar way to something like Herat, where it's like it's weird, but like you kind of just get used to it because it's not a game that fully takes itself seriously. So, despite the name. And then we got Red Faction, which is a game that, of course, we played very recently, and I think is a game that holds up in a lot of ways. Like, there's some parts where it doesn't hold up as much, but you know, the overall shooting, I think, is still pretty solid. The vehicle sections are surprisingly pretty good to control, especially like the flying / like submarine sections. Like those are surprisingly very good to control for a game from this time. And this was also a game that was pretty innovative with its engine. Granted, it did run on like a variant of the, well, it's the GeoMod engine, and like I think it's like a modified version of the Unreal Engine. But basically the game, you know, the biggest selling point is the fact that this game has destructible environments. Like, which basically would lead to games in the future such as Deep Rock Galactic in a weird sense. And so yeah, like as far as like being like a game that has, you know, destructible terrain, that's a big deal for 2001. Like, and hell, this was even on the PlayStation 2, which, I mean, they had to do some compromises for that version, but like the fact that that's capable for a PlayStation 2 is insane. So, of course, I have to nominate it. How can I not? And then we got Max Payne, which I know we didn't finish the game, but it's because the story itself is fucking, it's a lot to handle. But besides like that, it is still a pretty solid like third-person shooter, which that does suck that this is the only third-person shooter that's on the list, because they just weren't really a thing. Like they just weren't really like that common. But it's still a pretty fun game. The bullet time is what really did make this game stand out for the time. Yeah, it's bullet time mechanic, which of course is a cliche now, but this made it work. And I think that it works in the game's benefit, especially since, you know, it could help it can help determine gunfights. And I don't know, just the overall narrative also really does carry a lot of weight to the gameplay. So, especially with, yeah, of course, if you guys know, you know. Going back to the tactical shooter side of things, we've got the original Ghost Recon, which, yes, this is not a third-person shooter. This is the only game in the series that's fully, strictly a first-person shooter. I know the PC versions of the Advanced Warfighter games were also strictly that, but the console versions were third-person. So this basically was just more a spiritual successor to the original Rainbow Six games. And, well, similar to Operation Flashpoint, this game also helped define the tactical shooter genre. And, you know, this game, instead of in being in more enclosed quarters, like Rainbow Six, what made this game stand out was the fact that it was a bit more open environments. And while having the same squad mechanics that Rainbow Six had, or at least very similar ones. And I think that's pretty cool. So, granted, it is a hard as hell game because it's a tactical shooter, but I still think it's pretty fun even to this day. And then, well, I mean, you see it on the screen. This 2001, because this was the launch of the Xbox, you guys also know that means that this was also the year that brought us Halo Combat Evolved. Which, do I need to say anything about Halo to really talk, like, do I need to really say anything about Halo Combat Evolved? So, and last but not least, we got Return to Castle Wolfenstein, which I know, whenever I played this game earlier this year as well, I know I threw a little bit of shade at it because it is a hard as hell game. It's easily, like, I will say, like, the game itself can be a bit too hard at points. I don't know, just the enemies just deal a little bit too much damage for the type of game that's supposed to be. But the overall environmental detailing, the gunplay, and also the fact that, it was kind of, I mean, it's in the name, Return to Castle Wolfenstein, which meant that this was supposed to be a reboot for the series at the time. I think it was a good enough sort of, I don't want to say remake, because it's not really a remake of the original, like Wolfenstein 3D. But, like, being more, just kind of, like, evolving the formula, I think works in its favor. Especially since this game kind of represented, like, a mix between old and new. Like, it still plays like a classic, like, old retro shooter. Like, it still plays very similarly to something like a Quake, which, I mean, this was made on the same engine as Quake 3, so that makes sense. But also having some, like, more objective-based stuff that, like, a lot of newer shooter games at the time were doing. Like, it's a good, decent experience. And I will say, if you want to have an easier experience, just play this on the real RTCW mod. It makes the game a hell of a lot easier and more fun in the process. But anyways, let's go over the winner. It should be pretty obvious what's going to win, but I'm going to do my thing anyways. So, the award for the best shooter game of 2001, without a doubt, goes to Halo Combat Evolved. How could it not be Halo Combat Evolved? How could it not be this game? This game is one of the greatest of all time. And dare I say, it's one of the more, and again, also another game that is very important to me personally. So, but of course, let's go over the reasons. So, obviously this game, for its time, had very excellent controls. Like, not exactly how modern shooter controls were, but definitely, like, the beginning of that sort of feel. And, well, it's helped by the fact that this game has a bit more sparsed out levels that were more objective based. Taking a lot of cues from Medal of Honor of all things. So a bit of a connection there. The game also had a pretty cool atmosphere that wasn't too common with a lot of console games at the time. So it had a lot of the environmental detailing that we'd see on a lot of PC games, but weren't quite on console yet up until this point. And it's backed up by, of course, the memorable cast of characters, of course, Master Chief, Cortana, Captain Keyes. And, well, it pretty much was the game that helped pretty much define modern shooter games. I feel like from this point until pretty much to the current day. Because not only did the level design really, it was still, it was, open, fields, but the structure was that of was basically that of, the Medal of Honor games that were popular at the time. But also, this was one of the first popular games that had a limited weapon inventory, as in you can only carry 2 weapons at a time. Very similar to the Rainbow Six games. Granted, this is not a tactical shooter. Obviously, those games are. But it really does kind of showcase that this game was, Halo was really trying to strike the balance between an arcadey shooter experience with adding in more realistic elements to have that immersive experience. It really did help shape the way in which modern shooter games would be. Excuse me, sorry. In those little details, and I think it definitely works for the better. And of course, it being an amazing launch title for the Xbox, it makes sense as to why this thing popped out as much as it did. And, well, this is a biased pick, but this is one of my favorite games of all time. And so I do think that overall, it easily deserves the best shooter game category. Not a shadow of a doubt. So, all right. Best Sim Strategy Game category, aka the category that I remember we tried recording, but then the technical difficulties popped up, and because of that, we're doing this stream now. But I did actually make some changes from that, so I think it actually was for the better that I ended up delaying the stream. So what do I have for the Best Sim Strategy category? Well, again, this was a pretty big year as far as things. Oh, shoot. Hold on. God damn it. I didn't change the text, so it still shows the old text. But I changed some of the things. God damn it. Why do I do this to myself? Alright, there we go. Yeah, those are good. Again, I'm trying to make sure that it doesn't, showcase the winners. But anyways, so I will admit I originally had Stronghold for this, which was an RTS that was set in the medieval times. And well, I will give that an honorable nod because even though the later games weren't particularly that great, that first game I do find it still be a decent RTS experience. I feel stupid about the fact that I completely forgot about the original Tropico, which was a pretty big deal at the time, as city builders didn't really have much going on outside the SimCity games. Tropico was kind of one of the earlier examples of a direct competitor to SimCity. And this thing was actually pretty successful. I think this thing sold 2-3 million copies, which is insane for an up and coming franchise like this. This wasn't the studio's first game that was a decent size. That's why I didn't nominate this game for that category. But yeah, no, this game basically as far as being a more time period based city builder, this game is actually a lot of fun. I mean, yeah, there's a lot of systems that you need to learn how to manage, but that just is the nature of that genre in general. And I do ultimately think that this game deserves a lot of the praise that it has gotten over the years. And I mean, Tropico as a series, I've always found to be underrated as a whole. So, If you want to establish a 19 like a Cold War era dictatorship, well, we can do it in Tropico. But another game that I want to give a shout out to is Advanced Wars, which again, funny enough, this is not the first game in the Wars series, as some people might think, because you also had NES Wars and it was called Famicom Wars because it was only released in Japan, and then Super Famicom Wars, also only released in Japan. This was just the first game in the series that really took off outside of East Asia. And, well, for being a bit more of a turn-based tactics sort of strategy game, Advanced Wars I find to be pretty fun, especially since compared to those older games, this game was a lot more snappy. It was the first game to really use this sort of art style that we've known about with the War series from pretty much this point onwards. And yeah, it's just a fun little it's just like a fun GBA strategy game for the go. And yeah, like I find it to be pretty fun. Like, go check it out if you guys haven't. And then we've got ourselves Sid Meier's Civilization 3. So I will admit I am iffy with this game. Not because like I hate Civilization, because I actually really like Civilization, but like I feel like it wasn't until later entries as to where Civilization started to really get good. But Civilization 3 I still do respect. Like it wasn't quite 3D, but it was definitely starting to lean more towards like a 3D look. It was 2.5D at the time, like isometric. And so like it was a bit more in line with that sort of look for a time at least. And so yeah, I don't know. It's just a decent little game. And then we got Ace Combat 4, which is another game we've also played 2 years ago, actually, as a matter of fact. Pretty close to 2 years ago. And yeah, no, this game was a lot of fun. This was obviously following up the PlayStation 1 games. This was the first game for the newer systems. And yeah, the single player experience, like just actually going into combat, was obviously it's a bit more arcadey than like your genuine flight sims, which we've got one up here, which I'll get into in a little bit. But it's just a fun, immersive, just sort of flight around this, fictional conflict that honestly, like, also has a very interesting narrative. Granted, the cutscenes are kind of weak, but the actual, like, substance I find to still be pretty cool about the game. And just kind of the moral implications of fighting against other, like, fighter pilots. And the fact that they're not doing, like, a lot of the time, they're just doing what they're told. And just having a lot of those moral questions pop up. So, again, still, like, early as far as, like, narrative-driven stuff. But, like, definitely adding in the building blocks for that. So, and even if you don't care for that, this game still has a lot of fun sections. So, I gotta give credit where credit is due. And then we have Empire Earth, which is the game that I'll represent for the RTS category here. Basically a spiritual successor to Age of Empires, as a lot of the ex-developers of that game went over to make this game. And I don't know, this game, it was honestly, I think this was like one of the first fully 3D RTS games, if I'm not mistaken. If not the first. No, it wasn't the first, but it was one of the first. I do know that. And yeah, like, instead of it being limited to like a specific time frame, it pretty much covered the entirety of human history and even beyond a little bit. And just that sort of progression of building up your little like empire or faction or whatever, I think was pretty cool. And really did make it stand out even compared to Age of Empires. It basically just took elements from Age of Empires. Like it basically just took Age of Empires, throw in some elements of Civilization, and just made its own thing out of it. And I think that is pretty awesome. And then, last but not least, we've got a game that I didn't really mention the other games in the series, but that's mostly because of how iffy some of the quality of like the sequels are. But I also wanted to give a shout out to IL-2 Sturmovik as being the representative of like a true flight sim for this list. Which, you know, this game was made by an Eastern European studio. I actually think they were like a fully Russian studio. Let me double check. But yeah, this game like is honestly one of those flight sims that like it's definitely, you can play it as if it is a hardcore flight sim, but you could also play it as if it's a bit more casual. Like there's a lot of like things that you can tweak for your personal preference that this game is willing to accommodate for. And that's just not something that like you saw a lot of, especially within this sort of genre. And so like, yes, they're Russian. So yeah, like as far as like a a Russian made flight sim goes, this is honestly one of the most underrated games series that you can think of. So it's World War II, by the way. Like, this is this is a World War II flight sim. So which kind of fills in that niche. So yeah, if you want like a more realistic World War II flight sim, IL-2 Sturmovik is a very good option. So yeah, let's go over the winner, shall we? Sorry, I keep texting because someone keeps texting me back. So all right, so yeah, here we go. So the award for the best sim strategy game of 2001 goes to Ace Combat 4. I think this game's overall pretty solid. Again, it's more on the arcadey side, but I like the fact that this game was able to balance out, being an arcade flight game, while having some more like realistic elements into it. Like it's not the most realistic game, like it's definitely no IL-2 Sturmovik, but as far as like a good solid like entry level game for flight sim, I honestly would recommend it. Like especially since there's so many options that you can choose as far as aircraft is concerned. Also this game has a lot of good detailing for like the planes and vehicles themselves, which is something that I do appreciate, especially for PlayStation 2. And like I said, this game is a bit more story driven, which yeah, the cutscenes are kind of iffy, but like the actual like narrative that's told, it's pretty compelling. And like I said, it has a lot of sort of moral ideas that kind of get brought up about the idea of just who you're going up against in particular. And so I definitely recommend guys check out IL-2 Sturmovik if you guys haven't already. So or not IL-2 Sturmovik, Ace Combat 4, although that's definitely a good choice as well. All right, sports, racing, fighting games. I think this is actually the first time that this category is fully like loaded out with games. So other than maybe 2005, I think. I don't know. It's been a while since I did that one, but yeah, we were able to get a full roster of games for this category, which is insane. So what do we got here? Well, a lot of racing games, a fighting game, and 2 sports games, surprisingly enough. So, F-Zero Maximum Velocity, the long-awaited sequel for F-Zero, or at least a bit of more respectable game within the series, because, like, was there, like, an N64 game that came out? I'm gonna double-check that. But, like, as far as, like, you know, an F-Zero game is concerned, okay, there was an N64 game. All right, I'll keep that in mind. But yeah, as far as like a Game Boy Advance game for this particular thing, I definitely do think that F-Zero was a good like option for those who wanted a more handheld experience for, you know, a bit more of a sci-fi racing experience. And so yeah, I think this is a decent choice for that. And then we got Gran Turismo 3 for the PlayStation 2 side of things. Granted, I remember seeing that people think that this is one of the weaker games in the series in comparison to the previous game, because there were some compromises that were made. But I would still say that Gran Turismo 3 is still a overall good game that you can still have a lot of fun in. Granted, is it as good as some of the other games in the series? You can debate that, but like it still offers a pretty solid experience like throughout, and still has like a ton of racetracks and a ton of cars that you can mess with. So if you want a more realistic racing game from this time period, you can check out Gran Turismo 3, especially since Burnout, you know, was a bit more like on the arcadey side of things. So, but all right, and then we've got ourselves Mario Kart Super Circuit, which also was on the Game Boy Advance. Obviously, since it's a kart racer, it's not going to be as realistic. I mean, that's pretty obvious. It's Mario Kart, of course. If you know Mario Kart, you know what this is going to entail. But honestly, this is basically just Super Mario Kart if like it was controlled better. So it's fine. I think that's all I gotta really say about it. It's fine. There's some Mario Karts that I do prefer personally, but it's a decent experience. And then we got Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 3, which was the last of the time limit based Tony Hawk games, which I'm going to be honest, was probably for the better. And I do think that it's still a decent experience, even despite the fact that it does have the time limit. But it's definitely one that I think a lot of people just kind of forget about because this was the direct follow-up to 2, which I know a lot of people love Pro Skater 2. I mean, but of course that's a story for another day. But yeah, it's still a good experience overall. However, if you wanted a Tony Hawk, if you wanted like a skateboarding game that was a bit unique, how about we try Airblade? A game where it's a skateboard game where you don't ride on a skateboard. What do I mean by that? Well, you're actually using a hoverboard instead. But it's basically just Tony Hawk. And it's made by Criterion, the same people who made Burnout. So, granted, it's not as like, you know, extreme as Burnout, but it kind of has a lot of the similar things going on. And over, yeah, no, like it's actually kind of underrated as hell if you ask me. So that's at least sort of the pitch. It's pretty dumb. The story's really dumb. But like it's still a pretty solid game, the gameplay wise. And so yeah, if you want something that's like a bit more unique as far as skateboarding games, go check out Airblade. And then last but not least, we got ourselves Super Smash Bros. Melee, which of course this game needs no introduction. Everyone and their mother knows Melee. It's one of the most popular esports like games. How this was one of the first games that kind of helped sort of push like more competitive scenes. Like it's Melee. Like it's, yeah, like in this game, like it helped that this game came out near the beginning, like near the launch of the GameCube. So I think that's kind of what helped this game out a bit more, especially compared to the first game, because it, you know, there's some issues that the first Super Smash Bros. Had, but overall, pretty iconic game in its own right. So, but yeah, before we actually get into the winner, yes, I acknowledge there's some people in chat, but keep in mind this is a series where I don't read chat. Not because I don't like you guys, because I do like you guys. It's just I want to make sure that I can like get this all recorded and all that fun stuff. So I do apologize if there's a bit of that in chat. So again, I still love you guys. So, but yeah, let's go over the winner. So, God, I keep forgetting to put this in here. So, which thankfully, we actually are getting close to the end of this anyways, which means that this actually was the shortest stream we've done of this series so far. Damn. Huh. Weird. Anyways, so, the winner. So, the award for the best sport / racing / fighting game category of 2001 goes to Super Smash Bros. Melee. I will admit, like, this actually was a bit closer than you might think, because, you know, I think that Airblade's pretty cool, and I've been getting a lot into Gran Turismo as of late, but I do ultimately think that this is probably the best choice for this category, especially considering that this game's pretty iconic. Like, I mean, this game was just a massive improvement over the original game across the board. You know, obviously better, like, you know, better graphics because, you know, better console overall. But also better controls, better map, like better like arena layouts. This wasn't the first game to have a career mode. That wouldn't come until Brawl, but this game had, you know, way more characters. Like it just had a lot more. It just improved on pretty much everything. And this game also had, you know, its adventure and stadium modes where you could unlock these newer characters. And the fact that because there were so many that were in this game, it made it hard to master, but it was definitely a game that you could enter in pretty easily, as, you know, this was a 4-on fighting game. Obviously a trendsetter for that. I mean, there were several Smash clones, but like this was like one of the earliest games to be like, you know what, let's just have 4 like characters fight each other as opposed to just the 2. And I mean, it stuck. Like, it, you know, it stuck around, and hell, it stuck around even to this current day, because even to this very day there are still tournaments that use Super Smash Bros. Melee as the basis for their tournaments, like decades later, like almost 25 years later. That is insane to me. So this game, I feel like, just had to be the winner here, specifically because of the fact that like this was such a big deal when it first came out, and it's still being played as much as it is now. So ultimately, this one easily deserves the win. Which, of course, speaking of multiplayer, let's go over this category. Which this one's not going to be as long because it's going to be similar games that we've talked about before. So, and well, since it's the last category, like last time we'll have this category, I might as well, go it all out. So, but yeah, pretty much all these games we've already talked about, RuneScape and Dark Age of Camelot, both being MMOs. Operation Flashpoint, of course, being a tactical shooter. That was a bit more on the milsim side of things. Ghost Recon, of course, also being a tactical shooter, but being more on the like, I don't want to say casual, but it's definitely more downscaled. And of course, Halo kind of evolved, sort of being one of the progenitors for Xbox, Xbox Live. And of course, Super Smash Bros. Melee still being played to this day is insane. So we got ourselves a lot of choices here. And hell, I'll even say this. I might actually, I'm going to give an honorable nod to Ace Combat 4 as well. So, but, I have no experience, unfortunately, with multiplayer there because, the server shut down over a decade ago for that game. So, these are pretty much the choices I ended up having to choose for multiplayer. And, well, truth be told, that's ultimately why I do feel like it's probably best. This is the last year we'll talk about best multiplayer for, because the further along we go, not only is it going to be harder to find multiplayer games, but it's also going to be hard to try to find game like matches for said games. So, but let's pick the winner. So here we go. So the award for the best multiplayer game of 2001 goes to Tom Clancy's Ghost Recon. So this one's an interesting one because most people know Ghost Recon for its single player, but it also had a multiplayer and a cooperative mode. So, but I find those modes to actually be pretty fun. Of course, because this game is a lot more open, it has a lot more open spaces compared to the Rainbow Six games. It allows for much more, it adds for some interesting mechanics that couldn't be seen within those games. And unlike Operation Flashpoint, the fields aren't so big to where they're miles apart, and so it makes it to where it's condensed enough to not feel like it's completely wasted space, but it's also large enough to where you can have those sort of tense engagements. And also it's helped by the fact that this game has some pretty good controls for the time, and since it's a tactical shooter, it is hard as hell to play, but it helps you. So it's similar to Souls games. I'm not calling this the Souls game, the Souls of video, first person shooters. I'm not calling it that because that's dumb, especially since this came out 8 years prior. But the fact that this game does have the hardcore experience does make it to where your actions really do matter, and it helps you become a better player overall. And I mean, like I said, this game has its own form of terrorist hunt that we saw in Rainbow Six, and I think it's pretty much fun here as well. And yeah, overall, I find Ghost Recon to be a pretty surprisingly solid experience as far as multiplayer is concerned. Even though the campaign may predicted a war that happened in 2008. Yeah, go look that up. Yes, this game takes place in 2008, and it's a conflict in the country of Georgia where Russia invades. And this game came out in 2001. And, well, that war did end up happening in the late 2000s. So, well, you know. Yeah. That, by the way, that's why you see, not just in Ubisoft games, but pretty much a lot of games nowadays, that's why you see, like, the discretion where it's like, warning, this game does not mean to, like, replicate, this game does not replicate real life events. Anything that's, like, you know, represents real life is totally coincidental. It's because of this game. That's why there's that discretion in a lot of modern games. Like, which, it's kind of funny, but that's a 1 in a million chance of happening. So, thanks, Ghost Recon. You made everyone have to read a discretion. So, that's always fun. Alright, art direction. The most subjective category for this entire list. Which, fair enough. But I still think that it's a very important category that needs to be discussed, even in like this time period. And that pretty much can go for just any time period for video games as a whole. Especially since, like, you know, looks of the game matter to me, and, you know, I don't know, just think it's cool. So, and again, mostly games that we've talked about before. So we got Castlevania Circle of the Moon with its pixelated anime aesthetic that obviously was carried over from Symphony of the Night, but I think was definitely works in this game's favor as well. Klonoa 2 for its, you know, more 3D approach as opposed to the 2.5D, but still kind of have that sort of cutesy looking world that I think is pretty cool. Advance Wars for also having a bit more of an anime pixelated look. Silent Hill 2 for its dingy and creepy atmosphere. And then Jak and Daxter for its steampunk fantasy aesthetic. But I'm also going to give a shout out to Luigi's Mansion. For its more goofy, you know, spooky elements. That was a bit more lighthearted. And, well, of course, being a launch title for the GameCube. So, actually, the boxed launch title for the GameCube, as a matter of fact. And giving Luigi the spotlight. So yeah. I think this, I think these are all good choices that I think most people would agree on. Because, again, it's about the look of the game. So, and just sort of the, you know, art style, not graphical fidelity. Let me just remind myself. Okay, I did choose that. Okay, sorry, I just wanted to remember what I chose. So, but of course, let's choose the winner. So here we go. All right, so the award for the best art direction of 2001 goes to Advance Wars. I mean, this game, I think, looks pretty cool, and it helps complement the gameplay. Again, it's a very like pixel anime look, but I think it looks pretty cool. It's pretty much the style that they stuck with from the rest of the series onwards. Except for Battalion Wars on GameCube, but that game is not very good, but whatever. And it was an overhaul from the previous like games, because the previous games, at least Famicom Wars, had a more realistic look, at least for the time. And then Super Famicom Wars had a bit more of a chibi look. This one was just kind of more of a, you know, in between of that. And I think it works perfectly. Also very unique compared to a lot of other strategy franchises, because most strategy games try to go for the more realistic look. This one just decided, you know what, we're gonna not do that because we're cool, and they are cool for doing that. And well, it does fit in within the limitations that were on the Game Boy Advance, so good for them. All right, best narrative. Just like the best multiplayer category, this is unfortunately the last time we'll be doing a best narrative category, which is kind of sad, but ultimately I do think it is for the best, especially since the farther and farther away from the current day that we go in, the harder it's going to be for us to find, like, you know, genuinely solid stories. So though I will make sure to check for 2000, but that of course will be for in a few days. So again, it should not be a surprise that Max Payne, Silent Hill 2, Metal Gear Solid 2 are gonna get nominated. Hell, I'm even gonna throw in Halo Combat Evolved in here as well. Of course, Max Payne being about Max trying to, like, you know, go, like, pretty much, you know, seek revenge to the people who killed his family. Silent Hill 2, of course, you know, talking about James Sunderland and just exploring his personal depression. Metal Gear Solid 2 about the themes of conspiracy and espionage. And Halo Combat Evolved about just sort of overcoming the odds of an entire, you know, alien fleet while trying to make sure that they don't destroy the universe with a massive super weapon. But I also am going to give, well, props to Ace Attorney, or Phoenix Wright, Ace Attorney. Because yes, this was the debut of this particular franchise. You might know him from the DS, but he actually started off on the Game Boy Advance, funny enough. In Japan, though. So, and, well, I mean, it's more of a visual novel, sort of puzzle adventure hybrid game. And, well, I mean, you pretty much solve cases while using different clues that, you know, is pretty much given to you. And just kind of, I don't know, just the overall, you know, narrative beats, and just kind of learning to become, like, a good lawyer and honestly pseudo detective, I think actually helps benefit the narrative. And it's one of the reasons why, you know, it's still a recognizable series, like, and it's why, like, you know, we still to this day see all of the memes being like, objection. It's because, like, you know, it's a compelling, like, game overall. But I also wanted to give a bit of a shout out to Fatal Frame as well. God, I know that cover is terrible, but trust me when I say this, Fatal Frame is actually pretty cool and pretty fucked up series. Where you basically, you're basically just kind of trying to, like, you know, figure out the mysteries of, like, this, like, abandoned village in the middle of, like, Indonesia, I believe. And just kind of laying to rest a lot of the souls there, as well as, well, trying to make sure that some of the more evil spirits don't try to, like, you know, kill you. And it's a bit more, like, trust me, it may sound basic now, but it's a lot more engaging than you think. And honestly, this game, I would argue, is honestly as creepy in some, like, if not more creepy in some areas, like, than Silent Hill, and that's saying a lot. So, if you want a good survival horror game from the early 2000s, Fatal Frame is a pretty decent choice. Unfortunately, you might have to pirate the game, similar to Silent Hill 2, because unfortunately prices are way too goddamn high. Although, to be fair, it is still available on the PlayStation 3, and so if you have to, make sure you buy that now before they shut down those servers. So, yeah. But let's go over the best narrative. So, the award for the best narrative of 2001 goes to, well, best game narrative of 2001. It goes to Metal Gear Solid 2. Sons of Liberty. So, of course, it's following up on a lot of the themes that Metal Gear Solid 1 did, which that game was phenomenal as far as, like, its storytelling. And so it should not surprise you that, like, its sequel was also pretty damn good. Like I said, it continued a lot of the themes about espionage, and just kind of, the military industrial complex. But it also was a game that started to explore a lot of the themes about existentialism, basically just kind of figuring out your personal place, and just the idea of, like, a lot of, like, it really is interesting just kind of thinking about it, about a lot of the themes that this game presented, especially involving, like, a lot of, like, things like conspiracy theories and, like, just the distrusting of the government in, like, a postmodern society. Like, it really does surprisingly ring a lot closer to home, especially, like, in the modern age. Which, of course, I'm not going to get into politics now, but, like, let's just say it's gotten out of hand. So, but of course, it also, continuing to kind of explore Snake as a character, just as opposed to just being a soldier, because, he's a clone of, like, he's a clone of Big Boss. And so, just kind of, learning how to be beyond that definitely started to get explored here. And I mean, this was also the game that introduced Raiden. He wasn't quite the cyborg that we see him in Metal Gear Rising, but it's just kind of something I wanted to throw out there. So I don't know, and I mean, it's also, I don't know if I like the setting in this game more than the Alaska setting of the first game. I guess it just kind of depends on how you personally feel about that. But still a pretty good game that I recommend you guys check out. So, and slight spoilers, I will be playing this hopefully at some point in the near future. So, stay tuned for Metal Gear Solid. I was going to stream it this month, but because of just personal things, I just couldn't. So, I'll make that up for you guys hopefully in the near future. I'm really excited about it. But that then brings us into the final category of the night, the game of the year. So, as you guys saw, this was a really damn good year for games. And it's going to be very hard to try to choose just one of these games to represent the year. Like, I can guarantee you that no matter what I'm going to say, there's going to be people who are going to be upset. Because, well, just like with 2005 and 2007, 2001 was a case where it's like there were just too many good games for me to choose. But ultimately, these are the games I ended up choosing for Game of the Year. Max Payne for its, innovative third-person shooting and bullet time mechanics, and telling its, deep narrative about revenge and just, existentialism. Final Fantasy X for a lot of the innovations that it brought for not only Final Fantasy, but also role-playing games as a whole. Devil May Cry for its awesome hack and slash escapades and just overall being a pretty cool game. Silent Hill 2 for just sort of the like, being honestly a pretty solid horror game, and also presenting a deep narrative that was not actually pretty common for the time. Metal Gear Solid 2 for, continuing a lot of the, formatting that the original Metal Gear Solid had, and just refining a lot of the stealth mechanics. And Halo Combat Evolved for being, a pretty big launch title for the Xbox, and an overall phenomenal first-person shooter. So, like, these are really solid choices as far as, like, game of the year. But if you guys know the pattern of the series, you guys can probably tell what's going to be the winner. But I'm still going to do my thing for the new ones who are joining in. So, let's get on with the final award of the night. So, the game of the year of 2001 goes to Silent Hill 2. You definitely could have saw me give this to one of the other categories that we already talked about for Silent Hill 2. But I ultimately do think that Game of the Year is the best choice. And is a really solid, a solid award for honestly one of the best games of all time. So, first of all, this game has a very creepy atmosphere. It is honestly one of the most fucked up looking atmospheres that you can have, but in a very good way. Like, this game has such amazing environmental storytelling. And, like, even just at the very beginning of the game, and all the way through, it's perfect. This game also has some of the best storytelling of that era. Like, dare I'd say, like, if it weren't for Metal Gear Solid, the best. Like, although to be fair, you can make a good case of either or, but you cannot deny that, like, what happens with James Sunderland, and even a lot of the other characters like Eddie, and goddammit, the little girl, and even just the personification of Pyramid Head, kind of tying all that together, just really it makes for a very compelling narrative about some very deep topics, especially mental health, which is something that just was not a thing talked about at the time. Nowadays, mental health is, taken it way more seriously than it was like 25 years ago. But this was definitely like a game that really did put that on the forefront. And, well, I gotta say it. In my opinion, this is the best horror game of all time. It's not even a competition. Like, granted, there are some that have gotten close, for sure. You can definitely argue a Resident Evil game. You can argue Amnesia. You can even argue Dead Space. But in my opinion, this is one of the best horror games that, like, ever has been conceived. Like, and I have nothing but respect for that, especially as far as someone who isn't even really the biggest horror fan. And, well, if you guys remember my stream from 2 years ago, this game made me cry so much. Again, there are very few games that have ever made me cry. And I think we've actually covered every single game that, like, made me cry on the series. So this is the last one that, like, I guess I will be talking about. So, God, this game's so good. I'm really hoping that next week, when, like, the remake comes out, they don't botch it up. I'm very concerned about it specifically because of Bloober, because like I'm very critical of their games. Like, worst case scenario, if that ends up being inferior, just go pirate this game. I'm gonna advocate it for you guys. I know most people are not willing to say that, but there's very few games where I'm just gonna straight up tell you to do that. This is one of those games. The fact that Konami has not been able to sell this digitally is an actual crime. There's a PC version of this game, as well as Silent Hill 3. Why can't we play these games? Like, I know you don't have the source code, but you still at least have you still at least have this digital code. Let people be able to play the game on PC at least. That's all I've got to say about that. But to recap the show, look, I like to have the transitions. These are the words that we gave out tonight. Best game by new studio, of course, went to Burnout. Best action adventure went to Devil May Cry. Best platformer game went to Jak and Daxter. Best RPG went to Final Fantasy X. Best shooter game went to Halo Combat Evolved. Best sim strategy went to Ace Combat 4. Best sports racing fighting went to Super Smash Bros. Melee. Best multiplayer went to Tom Clancy's Ghost Recon. Best art direction went to Advance Wars. Best narrative went to Metal Gear Solid 2. And of course, the game of the year went to Silent Hill 2. As far as my top 10 favorites, and keep in mind, this is tentative, because there were so many damn good games from this year. My personal favorites, as of right now, included Devil May Cry, Silent Hill 2, Halo Combat Evolved, Ace Combat 4, Metal Gear Solid 2, Advance Wars, Ghost Recon, Castlevania Circle of the Moon, Final Fantasy X, and Red Faction. And as far as honorable mentions / guilty pleasures, we've got ourselves a decent amount of games. So I wanted to give a shout out to Oni, which was actually made by Bungie, funny enough. So it's an action adventure shooter hybrid game. Go check it out. Clive Barker's Undying, a pretty decent first-person shooter that has a lot of horror elements. Legend of Zelda Oracle of Seasons and Oracle of Ages. Dr. Mario 64 as more of a guilty pleasure sort of thing, because I guess I kind of like more I like Tetris-like games. Desperados Wanted Dead or Alive for more tactics sort of games. Alone in the Dark New Nightmare, mostly for its atmosphere. Klonoa Empire Dreams, because I would have nominated for platformer, but the one game for franchise rule unfortunately blocked it. Zoo Tycoon. I was kind of surprised they did not have that high ratings. What? Yeah, I was kind of surprised. I thought that was gonna have enough, but no, it didn't. Stronghold, I wanted to also give an honorable mention to, because I actually think that it is a overall solid game. I just kind of wish the sequels were better. Alien vs. Predator 2. A surprisingly decent Alien game. This was obviously, I talked about it before, but that was before I actually played it. I've since played it, and yeah, it's actually pretty good. It sucks that it's not available online. The first game is, but not this, which is weird. Legacy of Kain Soul Reaver 2, which this one's hilarious considering that a remake of this game literally just got announced last week. Or I think the first game. So that's pretty funny. Siphon Filter 3. Just kind of being one of the last PS1 games to kind of, be its own thing. So I gotta give respect. Wizardry 8 being the last of the Wizardry series, so rest in peace. And then Star Wars Rogue Squadron 2 Rogue Leader for the Game Boy Advance. But I also forgot about one more game, so let me make sure I add it, because I can't believe I forgot about this game. And keep in mind, these are just the games that I remembered. because there's plenty of other games that like came out from that year that like I can guarantee you a lot of people like. So, but I ran out of space for Galactic Battlegrounds, god damn it. So yeah, another Star Wars game, Star Wars Galactic Battlegrounds. I'll also give an honorable nod to basically Age of Empires, but Star Wars. So if that sounds cool, go check it out. But that wraps up the Game Awards for 2001. Honestly, like I said, and as I've shown, easily one of the best years in gaming history. Like, I know some people will say the best, and while I still think that like 2005 is my personal favorite year for video games, 2001 is no sloucher, and really did showcase that like, yeah, gaming was definitely really going up. And of course, we've obviously talked about the rest of the 2000s, but unfortunately, all good things have to come to an end, because I'll be talking about the year 2000 on Wednesday, and I've unfortunately got some bad news about that year. So, but of course, we'll talk about it when we talk about it. But regardless, I hope you guys did enjoy this episode. If you guys did, make sure to hit that follow button down below and turn on the bell icon so that you'll be notified exactly when I'm streaming. If you're watching this on YouTube, make sure you hit the subscribe button and also turn on the bell icon over there. While you guys are at it, make sure to check out the links down below as well, specifically SoundCloud and Discord. If you want to directly support me on Twitch, make sure to hit the subscribe button. If you can't necessarily do that, that's completely fine. I'm just glad that you guys took time to watch this. But regardless of all, bye.